Imagine waking up before the sun rises. Not because you want to, not because you set an alarm, but because if you don't, someone will beat you. You have no name that matters. You have no future you control. You own nothing. Not even the breath in your lungs belongs to you. Tonight, let that thought settle into your mind slowly, gently, like dust falling in an ancient Roman corridor. Because for the next 2 hours, you are going to travel back in time, not to the grand marble halls of emperors, not to the triumphs of generals, but to the quiet, heavy, forgotten world of the people who built Rome with their hands and their suffering. The people history almost never talks about. Stay with me. Close your eyes if you like. Let your breathing slow, because this story is going to carry you somewhere very, very far away, and by the time we reach the end, you will have lived an entire day inside the most extraordinary and heartbreaking civilization the ancient world ever produced. Just breathe and listen. The city of Rome in the 1st century, somewhere between the year 50 and 100 after the birth of Christ. The population of this city sits somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. It is the largest city on earth, and of those millions, nearly 1/3 are slaves. Not 1 or 2,000, not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of human beings living in complete legal ownership by other human beings. Scholars argue over the exact numbers, but the most careful estimates suggest that at the height of the Roman Empire, somewhere between 2 and 3 million slaves lived within Italy alone. The entire system of Roman civilization, its food, its buildings, its roads, its entertainment, its household comfort, its agricultural output, its administrative records, everything ran on the labor of enslaved people. And yet we know so little about them as individuals. We know the emperors. We know the senators. We know the philosophers. But the slave who cooked the philosopher's dinner, who washed the senator's toga, who carried the emperor's litter through the crowded streets of Rome, that person is mostly invisible in the historical record. Tonight we are going to make them visible. We are going to follow one day in their life, from the very first moment of consciousness before sunrise all the way through the long, exhausting hours of labor to the brief stillness of night, when sleep was the only freedom they truly possessed. Let us begin at the very beginning. Let us begin in the dark. The hour is what the Romans called the first hour of night, still deep and black, perhaps 3 or 4 in the morning by our reckoning. The city of Rome, which seems never to fully sleep, still hums with distant noise. Wagons rumble through the streets because Roman law prohibited wheeled vehicles from the city center during daylight hours, so merchants and delivery drivers worked through the night. There is the creak of wood, the clatter of hooves on stone, the occasional shout of a drunk nobleman stumbling home from a dinner party that began many hours ago. Rome is never truly silent. But in the small back room of a large urban house, what the Romans called an insula or a domus, depending on the wealth of the owner, our slave lies on a thin mat on the floor. Not a bed in the way you might imagine. Perhaps a rough wool blanket. Perhaps a wooden frame with ropes stretched across it if the owner is generous. The room is shared. Other slaves sleep nearby, their breathing slow and even in the darkness. The room smells of bodies, of cheap oil from the small clay lamp that burns in the corner, of the faint damp that creeps through the stone walls. His name, let us say, is Philemon. It is a Greek name, which tells us something immediately. Enormous numbers of Roman slaves were Greek, or came from regions where Greek culture dominated: Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, the Eastern Mediterranean world. When Rome conquered those territories, it did not just take land and tribute. It took people. Hundreds of thousands of people captured in war, purchased in slave markets, born into slavery from enslaved mothers. Philemon might have been born in this very house, a child of a slave woman who was herself born into slavery. Or he might have been captured as a boy when a Roman legion swept through a Greek city on the other side of the world. Or he might have been sold by his own impoverished parents during a famine, a practice that, while technically illegal at various points in Roman history, continued in desperate circumstances. For our purposes tonight, let us say Philemon is perhaps 30 years old. He has lived in this household for most of his adult life. He is what the Romans called a domesticus, a household slave, which meant he worked inside the house rather than in the fields or the mines. This distinction mattered enormously. Agricultural slaves and mining slaves faced conditions so brutal that many did not survive more than a few years. Household slaves, while still entirely without rights, without freedom, without autonomy, were at least less likely to die of sheer physical exhaustion before middle age. Some household slaves in wealthy Roman families lived into their 50s and 60s. Some were educated, trusted, even deeply attached to the families that owned them, though we must always remember that attachment formed within the context of total power and total powerlessness. Philemon stirs before the light changes. Something internal, some body knowledge trained over years of necessity, wakes him. He does not groan. He does not stretch luxuriously. He opens his eyes in the darkness, and for just one moment, perhaps two, he lies still. This is the only truly private moment of his day, before duty reasserts itself, before the hierarchy of the household presses down on him again. In this breath of darkness, he is simply a man, awake, breathing, feeling the coolness of the air on his face. Then he rises. He has no elaborate morning routine. He washes his face and hands with water from a clay jug kept in the corner of the room. He relieves himself in the shared chamber pot that will need to be emptied later, a task that will fall to someone else this morning. He pulls on his tunic, a simple garment of undyed wool or linen that falls to the knee, perhaps belted at the waist. Roman slaves wore the same basic garment as free Romans of the lower classes, though perhaps of rougher fabric, perhaps more worn, perhaps without the small details that marked a free person's status. There was no special slave uniform in Roman law, though at one point a Roman senator famously proposed that slaves should be required to wear distinctive clothing so they could be identified in public. The proposal was rejected, and the reason given was both practical and revealing. If slaves could see how many of them there were, the senators worried they might be tempted to organize. Philemon moves quietly through the sleeping house. He knows every corridor, every threshold, every creaking stone. He moves like water around obstacles, practiced and silent. The house he serves in belongs to a mid-ranking Roman citizen, a man of the equestrian class perhaps, wealthy enough to own perhaps a dozen or 15 slaves, not the enormous households of the truly rich that might number in the hundreds, but comfortable enough that the running of the house requires constant organized labor. His first task of the morning is fire. The kitchen hearth must be lit before anyone in the household wakes. This is not a simple matter of striking a match. There are no matches. Fire in ancient Rome was made with flint and iron or with a fire drill, rubbing wood against wood until friction creates an ember, then nursing that ember with tinder, with dry grass or papyrus fibers or scraps of cloth, blowing gently, steadily, cupped hands protecting the fragile new flame from any draft. It requires patience. It requires skill developed over years. Philemon has done this 10,000 times. His hands know the motion without instruction from his mind. The kitchen in a Roman house was a relatively simple room. The hearth was raised, built of brick or stone, with a flat-top surface where pots could rest over the fire. There was no chimney in the way we imagine, just a hole in the roof or high in the wall to let smoke escape, which it did imperfectly, leaving the kitchen permanently darkened with soot, the walls black with years of accumulated smoke. The air in the kitchen always tasted slightly of ash and fire. The Roman cook, whether slave or free, lived with perpetually irritated eyes and lungs that over decades absorbed more smoke than they should. As the fire catches and grows, Philemon feeds it carefully. Charcoal was the preferred fuel for cooking fires in wealthy Roman households, as it burned hotter and cleaner than wood, though wood was used when charcoal was expensive or unavailable. He adds the fuel piece by piece, building the heat gradually, watching the color of the flame, listening to it. Fire had a voice he had learned to read. A healthy fire spoke in a low, steady roar. A struggling fire hissed and spat. Now the first light of actual dawn begins to creep into the world. Rome wakes with noise. This is something visitors to ancient Rome always commented on. The city was extraordinarily loud. The wagons that had rumbled through the night were now pulling back out of the city or completing their deliveries, their iron-rimmed wheels on the stone streets a constant percussion. Street vendors began to call. Dogs barked. Somewhere nearby a cock crowed, because even in the dense urban heart of Rome, people kept chickens in courtyards and on rooftops. The smell of the city in the morning was layered and complicated. Bread baking in the bakeries that operated through the night. The smell of urine from the public latrines and from the large pottery jars placed outside fullers' shops. Because human urine was used to clean and process wool, and Romans urinated into these jars as a matter of course. The smell of animals, horses and mules and donkeys in their stalls. The smell of the river Tiber, which in the summer especially carried a powerful organic odor from all the city's waste that ultimately found its way into its waters. Philemon does not find this smell unpleasant particularly. It is simply the smell of morning. It is the smell of home, in the only sense that word has meaning for him. He begins preparing water for the household. Roman houses at this level of wealth might have running water piped in from the great aqueduct system, one of the genuine engineering marvels of the ancient world. The aqueducts of Rome brought fresh water from sources many miles away, through tunnels and over bridges and down into the city in a constant gravity-fed flow. But even in houses with running water, the pressure was typically only strong enough to fill a basin at ground level. Water for upper floors, water for specific cooking purposes, water for the elaborate morning washing rituals of the Roman upper class. All of this had to be carried by hand. And that was Philemon's work too. He fills large clay amphorae, each one weighing perhaps 15 or 20 kilograms when full, and carries them to where they need to be. He makes this trip multiple times. His back and shoulders carry years of this labor, muscles developed through thousands of repetitions of exactly this kind of heavy, unglamorous, necessary work. He does not count the trips. He does not think particularly about the weight. He thinks about the sequence of tasks that need to be completed before his master wakes, running through the list in his mind the way a craftsman checks his tools before beginning work. The dominus, the master of the household, will wake perhaps 2 hours after sunrise. This is typical for a Roman man of leisure or of business who follows the rhythms of Roman social life, which concentrated its most important activities in the morning hours. But before the master wakes, his personal body slave must be ready. In larger households, this might be a separate specialized slave. In this household of moderate means, this duty falls to Philemon on alternating days. The Romans had very specific morning rituals for grooming, and these rituals required human assistance in ways that we in our age of bathrooms and electric razors might find surprising. To begin with, shaving. Roman men of the elite classes were typically clean-shaven during the 1st and 2nd centuries, following a fashion established by earlier emperors. Shaving in the ancient world was done with an iron or bronze razor, sharp but nowhere near as refined as modern blades, applied to the face without any of the lubricating foams we might use today. The slave who shaved his master had to be extraordinarily skilled and extraordinarily careful. A nick or a cut was not merely an inconvenience. It could result in punishment. Philemon had learned to shave when he was quite young, taught by an older slave who had held this duty before him, and he was good at it. His hands were steady. He knew how to stretch the skin taut with the fingers of his left hand while drawing the blade with his right, the angle exact, the pressure precise. There was also the matter of hair. Roman men of status often had their hair carefully arranged, oiled and combed into the styles fashionable at court. And then there was the matter of the master's hands. which might need to be cleaned and filed, and his clothing, which had to be selected, laid out, and arranged with attention to the social engagements of the day, and the small rituals of Roman religious observance that began every household morning, because Roman religious practice was deeply embedded in the rhythms of daily life. The lararium was the household shrine, a small niche in the wall or a freestanding cabinet that held figurines of the lares, the household gods, protective spirits of the family and home. Every morning the master of the household, or his representative, would make a small offering at the lararium. A pinch of incense, a splash of wine, a bit of food from the previous night's meal, a brief prayer. This was not particularly solemn or elaborate. It was as routine as any daily habit, a checking in with the divine forces that protected the home, a small acknowledgement that human prosperity depended on divine favor. Slaves often participated in these household religious rituals, and interestingly, Roman religion did not exclude slaves from worship. The gods were available to everyone. Freedom was not a prerequisite for prayer. The master wakes. Let us call him Marcus. He is perhaps 45 years old, a man of business who deals in imported goods, the kind of commercial activity that the Roman elite technically looked down upon as beneath their dignity, but which many of them quietly engaged in through intermediaries and slaves who conducted business on their behalf. Marcus is neither particularly cruel nor particularly kind. He is what the Roman system made him, a man who has owned other human beings since his birth, who has never been required to question whether that ownership is just or unjust, who treats his slaves roughly the way a modern person might treat a household appliance, with the expectation that they will function correctly, with occasional irritation when they don't, with neither deep affection nor deep hostility as a general rule, though both were possible on any given day, depending on his mood. Philemon helps Marcus dress. Roman elite clothing was more complicated than it appears. The toga, that famous garment, was actually worn mainly for formal public occasions and was rarely worn at home. At home, Marcus would wear a tunic, perhaps with a light wrap over it. But preparing for a day of business meetings might require the toga, and draping a toga correctly was a genuine skill. The toga was a large semicircular piece of wool, as much as 6 meters long, and draping it correctly required knowing how to fold it, how to anchor it at the shoulder, how to arrange the folds so they fell correctly. Getting this wrong would be embarrassing for the master and potentially painful for the slave. While helping Marcus dress, Philemon must simultaneously manage the morning information that comes into the household. Other slaves have already been busy. Someone has gone to the bakery to bring fresh bread, because most Roman urban households did not bake their own bread. The bakeries of Rome operated around the clock, and buying bread was simply part of daily Roman life, as normal as any modern grocery purchase. Someone else has checked in with the door slave, the ostiarius, who slept at or near the front door and received any messages or callers who came before the household was properly awake. There are messages this morning. A wax tablet has arrived, carried by a slave from another household, containing a written note from one of Marcus's business associates about a meeting scheduled for this afternoon. Philemon cannot read. Most slaves could not. But some slaves, particularly those who served educated masters in administrative or secretarial roles, were taught to read and write, and in those cases a literate slave became enormously valuable. The household does have one literate slave, a man named Soges, who serves as Marcus's secretary and who handles all written correspondence. Soges is in many ways the most powerful slave in the household, trusted with sensitive business information, accompanying Marcus to meetings, even sometimes conducting negotiations on his master's behalf. Soges lives a life noticeably more comfortable than Philemon's, eats better food, sleeps in a slightly better space, and is treated with somewhat more consideration. But he is still a slave. He can still be sold. He can still be beaten. He can still be executed if Marcus decides he has committed a serious enough offense. The morning meal for the slaves comes early, and is simple. Romans ate lightly in the morning as a general rule. The main meal of the day was in the late afternoon or early evening. Breakfast in a Roman slave's life was typically bread, perhaps with a little olive oil or a bit of cheese if things were going well. Olives were common, perhaps a small portion of something left from the previous night's dinner. The food that slaves ate in Roman households varied enormously based on the wealth of the owner and the perceived value of the slave. Agricultural slaves on large rural estates sometimes received barely enough to survive. Household slaves in wealthy urban homes sometimes ate reasonably well by the standards of the ancient world, because a malnourished slave who looked terrible reflected badly on the household that owned him. There was a pragmatic element to slave welfare that coexisted with the fundamental brutality of the institution. Philemon eats quickly, standing. There is no leisure in this meal. It is fuel and nothing more. The bread is coarse, made from wheat that has been ground imperfectly, with bits of grit that over years wore down the teeth of nearly everyone in the ancient world, slave and free alike. Dental archaeology, the study of teeth from ancient remains, shows us that virtually all Romans suffered from significant dental wear and tooth decay. The bread Philemon eats every morning is part of that story, the slow grinding down of enamel by grit in the flour, a damage accumulating so gradually that no individual morning meal feels catastrophic, but which across a lifetime leaves its mark. The sun is fully up now. The household has come alive. Let us step back from Philemon for a moment and look at the larger scene of this house at morning, because understanding the context helps us understand what his day contains. In a Roman urban house of the equestrian class, perhaps a dozen to 15 slaves filled different roles. There was the ostiarius, the door slave, who controlled access to the house, a position of some authority because he decided who waited and who entered. There were the kitchen slaves, at least 2 or 3, who handled all food preparation. There was the personal body slave who served the master directly. There was the secretary. There were general household slaves who cleaned, carried, fetched, and did all the 1,000 small physical tasks that a large household required. There might be a slave whose specific duty was to care for the children of the household. There might be a slave who accompanied the mistress of the house on her social visits, carrying her purchases and parcels. There might even be a slave trained in basic medicine, because Roman households often had their own medical resources rather than relying on the physicians who practiced publicly in the city. All of these people lived their entire lives within the walls of this house and the small world immediately around it. They knew each other with the deep familiarity of people who share space constantly. They had their own social hierarchies, their own friendships and enmities, their own small economies of favor and resource. They spoke to each other in a mixture of languages. Latin was the common tongue, but Greek was widely spoken, and depending on the origin of various slaves, other languages might surface in conversations, fragments of Syrian or Egyptian or the Celtic languages of Gaul and Britain. The back corridors of a Roman household were a kind of hidden city within the city. Now Philemon moves to the next phase of his morning duties. The house must be cleaned. Roman houses accumulated remarkable amounts of dust and dirt quickly, partly because of their open design with the central atrium open to the sky, which let in not just light, but also wind carrying the extraordinary dust of ancient Rome, a city of unpaved streets and constant construction and crumbling stone and the ashes of 10,000 cooking fires. Philemon sweeps. He sweeps with a broom made of bundled twigs or straw, methodical, working from the far corners of each room toward the central atrium, moving the dust and debris toward the drain in the center of the impluvium, the shallow pool of water that collected rainwater in the middle of the atrium. The sweeping takes time. The house is not enormous by the standards of truly wealthy Romans, but it is substantial. Several rooms open off the central atrium. There is a tablinum, the master's study and reception room where business is conducted. There are cubicula, the small bedrooms where family members sleep. There is the triclinium, the dining room, where the household's most important social activity takes place. And further back, past the atrium, there is often a peristyle garden, a small courtyard surrounded by columns with plants, and perhaps a small fountain. Each of these spaces requires attention. As Philemon moves through the house sweeping, he operates within a carefully maintained invisibility. This is something that Roman sources occasionally mention and that historians have thought a great deal about. Slaves in Roman households were expected to be present without being seen, functional without being noticed, responsive without being acknowledged unless specifically addressed. They learned to move in ways that minimize their presence, to keep their eyes down, to speak only when spoken to complete their tasks with a kind of studied silence. This was not necessarily a natural state. It was trained into them from childhood. The Roman household system required its enslaved members to be simultaneously there and not there, fully human beings engaged in fully human labor, but socially invisible in a way that served the comfort and ego of the people who owned them. This invisibility had psychological consequences that we can only imagine through the fragmentary evidence we have. There are moments in Roman literature where slaves appear briefly as characters, and occasionally a Roman writer of the more thoughtful variety, a Seneca for instance, will make observations that reveal an awareness of the humanity of enslaved people that sits uncomfortably alongside the system that was the foundation of everything. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, actually wrote letters that argued quite directly for better treatment of slaves based on their shared humanity. He pointed out that a slave might be your intellectual superior. He argued that fortune alone separated master from slave. These were radical ideas, gently expressed, that went absolutely nowhere in terms of actual social reform. The institution was too fundamental to be argued away by philosophy. But back to Philemon, sweeping, room by room, in the brightening morning. By mid-morning, the house has been cleaned. Water has been brought. The master has been groomed and dressed, and has conducted his morning rituals, and is now seated in the tablinum, receiving his first visitors of the day. This is called the salutatio, the morning greeting, a ritual that was fundamental to Roman social life. Clients, people of lower social standing who were attached to a wealthier patron in a relationship of mutual obligation, would come to the house of their patron every morning to pay their respects. The patron might give them advice, write them a letter of recommendation, give them a small amount of money called a sportula. In return, the client provided political support, social backing, and simple, visible loyalty. The number of clients who came to your morning greeting was a measure of your status and importance. A great senator might have hundreds of clients appearing at his door. Marcus has perhaps 20 or 30. During the salutatio, Philemon stands near the door of the tablinum, ready to fetch items if the master needs them, ready to carry messages to other parts of the house, ready to serve wine or water if a client is to be entertained briefly. He hears everything. He witnesses the business of the household, the negotiations, the requests, the small social performances of men maintaining their position in the hierarchy. He is so practiced at invisibility that the clients do not modify their conversation because of his presence. He hears things that are meant to be confidential. Roman masters sometimes worried about this, and indeed slaves who heard sensitive information and then somehow communicated it to the wrong people could cause serious problems for their owners. But the system required slaves to be present at almost all moments of household life. So the alternative was simply to not acknowledge that the slave had ears and a mind. What does Philemon think about, standing there waiting? We cannot know with any certainty, but we can speculate from what we know of human nature and from the fragmentary evidence we have of slave inner life in the ancient world. He might be thinking about nothing in particular, in the way that people engaged in quiet waiting often let their minds drift into a pleasant blankness. He might be listening to the conversation with genuine interest, because the business dealings his master conducted affected the prosperity of the household and therefore his own daily conditions. He might be thinking about another slave in the household, about relationships formed in the compressed world of the slave quarters. He might be thinking about his mother, if she was still alive, or about a child of his own if he had children. Slaves in Roman households did form families. Roman law did not recognize slave marriages as legally binding, using instead the term contubernium, meaning something like tent sharing or cohabitation rather than matrimonium, the word for legal marriage. But the emotional reality of these relationships was often just as deep and serious as any free marriage. Slaves raised children together, formed lasting bonds, grieved when members of their family were sold away. And sale was always the constant threat hanging over every relationship within the slave world. At any moment, for any reason, a slave or a slave's partner or a slave's child could be sold to a different household, a different city, a different part of the empire entirely, ending the relationship as completely as death. Many Roman slaves lived with the constant low background dread of separation, trying not to love too much or too completely, because everything they loved existed at the pleasure of someone else's financial decisions. Philemon has a daughter. Let us say her name is Irene. She is perhaps 8 years old, born in this household from a slave woman named Chloe who died some years ago of a fever, leaving the child to be raised in the collective care of the other household slaves. Irene is bright and quick, already useful in small ways around the house, helping in the kitchen, running small errands, learning the layout and rhythms of household service as naturally as other children learn to read. Philemon loves her with a fierce and careful love, the love of a parent who knows that the thing most precious to them exists entirely outside their power to protect. He has never discussed with Irene the reality of her situation in any complete way. She is too young, but he watches her. He notices how the mistress of the house sometimes looks at her, calculating, considering her growing usefulness. He knows that in a few years she will be fully deployed as a household slave, and that her fate after that will depend entirely on the decisions of people who own her body as completely as they own the furniture she dusts. The morning salutation ends. The clients disperse back into the city. Marcus takes a light second meal, something more substantial than the slave's bread, but still modest by the standards of the elaborate dinners that Roman literature is so fond of describing. This mid-morning meal is more like what we would call a late breakfast, perhaps bread with honey, eggs, some fruit, a bit of cold meat left from yesterday. Philemon serves this meal. Service at the Roman table involved a particular set of skills and protocols. Food was not simply placed on a table and left there. Dishes were presented in a specific sequence. Cups were refilled continuously. The serving slave needed to move smoothly without crowding the diners, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to remove dishes that had been finished without making the table seem depleted, to manage the small logistics of multiple dishes in a small space with practiced ease. Roman dinner service was genuinely skilled work, and the best serving slaves were trained with something approaching the seriousness of a modern sommelier or maitre d'. After the master's morning meal, there is a brief period of relative quiet in the household. Marcus will spend some time in his tablinum working on correspondence with Sojas, dictating letters to his secretary who will write them out in the careful shorthand script that Roman secretaries used before writing fair copies on papyrus. Philemon has other tasks. There is shopping to be done. Going to the market is one of the more interesting departures from the house that a household slave like Philemon might make on a regular day. Roman markets, and particularly the busy street markets and permanent shops that line the ground floors of insulae buildings throughout the city, were extraordinary places. The streets of Rome were narrow, most of them unpaved, crowded at all hours with pedestrians because wheeled traffic was banned during the day. The noise was constant. Vendors called. Musicians played. Children ran. Arguments erupted and resolved. The whole city pressed together in a density that modern urban dwellers might find almost physically overwhelming. Philemon goes to market carrying a basket and a small amount of money that Marcus has authorized him to spend. The money is not his. He is not paid. But trusted household slaves were often given funds to conduct specific purchases, a practical necessity in a world where the master could not personally go shopping every day. Moving through the streets of Rome required navigating a complicated social geography. Free citizens and slaves moved through the same spaces, but with very different social weights. A slave who bumped into a freeborn Roman and failed to apologize immediately might face consequences. A slave who was seen moving through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time might be questioned or stopped. The Roman world had elaborate and sometimes paranoid systems for controlling the movement of enslaved people, including the requirement that slaves traveling away from home on their master's business should sometimes carry a small token or document indicating their permission to be abroad. The market is sensory overload in the most wonderful and terrible way. Fishmongers cry their wares. The smell of fish, both fresh and not quite fresh, mingling with the smell of spices from the shop next door, where an Eastern merchant sells cinnamon and pepper and silphium at prices that only the wealthy can really afford. There is a butcher with cuts of pork hanging from hooks, because pork was the most commonly consumed meat in Rome. There are stalls selling vegetables, cabbages and leeks and onions and beans, the everyday diet of ordinary Roman life. There is olive oil, the single most important substance in the Roman kitchen, used for cooking, for light, for cleaning the body, for medicine, for almost everything. There are amphorae of garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way modern Italians use salt and soy sauce combined, a condiment so fundamental to Roman cooking that major garum production facilities operated across the empire, their products shipped in distinctive pottery vessels to every corner of the Roman world. Philemon shops efficiently. He knows what the household needs. He knows the regular vendors who sell good quality at fair prices. He is not distracted by the entertainment of the market in the way that a tourist might be, because this is work, because dawdling would be noticed, because he has limited time and a list in his head that must be completed. But he is also, simply, a human being in a vivid place, and some part of his awareness takes in the color and noise and human variety of the market with something that is not quite pleasure, but is something adjacent to it. The awareness of being alive in a complex world. The small satisfaction of negotiating a purchase well, of recognizing good quality from bad, of completing a task with skill. He buys what is needed and returns to the house. The late morning moves into noon. The Roman day is divided differently from ours. The Romans divided daylight into 12 equal hours regardless of the season, which meant that a summer hour was considerably longer than a winter hour. The midday hours in summer, what the Romans called the 6th and 7th hours, were the hottest and least active hours of the day. Roman culture had something very like a siesta tradition, particularly in summer, when the heat of the Mediterranean afternoon made vigorous activity uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous. Even in the city, activity slowed in the middle of the day. The baths would fill up later in the afternoon. The main meal of the day would come in the late afternoon or early evening. The hottest hours were for rest or for lighter tasks. For slaves, rest was relative. There were always tasks. But the pace of the household slowed in the midday hours, and Philemon might find himself with an hour or two of what might loosely be called free time. Romans did recognize that slaves needed some periods of rest and even recreation. Cato the Elder, the very conservative Roman statesman of the earlier republic who wrote an agricultural manual, recommended specific rest periods for farm slaves. Urban household slaves generally had more informal arrangements. But the practical reality was that a slave worked to exhaustion without any rest would become sick, incompetent, or rebellious, none of which served the master's interests. What did slaves do with small pockets of free time? We have some evidence. They played games. Dice games were enormously popular throughout Roman society at all levels. Technically illegal under Roman law, but universally practiced and universally ignored by authorities. Board games existed, some of them resembling backgammon or checkers in their basic structure. Slaves in large households might use these hours to conduct the small economies of their own social world, trading favors, sharing food, having conversations that were not about work. They might maintain their personal belongings, whatever small items a slave was allowed to own. They might sleep, simply sleep, banking rest against the long hours of labor that surrounded every day. Philemon, in this midday pause, sits in the courtyard garden with two other slaves, a man named Titus who is perhaps 50 years old and who has been in this household longer than anyone, and a young woman named Daphne who works in the kitchen and who is perhaps 22. They sit in the shade of a vine that grows along the wall of the peristyle, and they eat olives from a small bowl that Daphne has brought from the kitchen, and they talk. What do they talk about? They talk about the other slaves in the household. They talk about Marcus's mood this morning, which was good, which means the day will be easier. They talk about the dinner party that is planned for tomorrow evening, which means extra work, but also access to better food afterward, because the leftovers from a dinner party were typically distributed among the household slaves, and a good dinner party meant good leftovers. They talk about Titus's knee, which has been hurting for several weeks, and about whether the old slave should say something to the master's wife or try to get access to one of the city's medical practitioners. They talk, briefly and with the careful avoidance of too much explicit emotion, about a slave from a neighboring household who was sold last month, whose fate is unknown and who is almost certainly never going to be encountered again. This is the texture of their conversation. Practical, immediate, occasionally funny, sometimes quietly devastating. Human beings talking about the world immediately around them, because the world immediately around them is the only world they substantially control. The afternoon arrives. The household begins to move again as the day cools slightly. Marcus has business this afternoon, and he will travel across the city to meet with associates and potentially visit the Forum, the beating heart of Roman public life, where legal cases were argued, where political speeches were made, where the business of the city and the empire was constantly conducted in the open air under the gaze of the great temples. When Marcus goes out, a small retinue accompanies him. This is important for status. A wealthy Roman man who walked alone through the streets of Rome looked poor, because wealthy men had people to accompany them. The larger your retinue, the more impressive your social standing. Marcus takes Sojas, who carries documents, and two other slaves who serve as general escorts and luggage carriers. Philemon remains in the house. This is usual. The house cannot be left empty and untended. The remaining slaves have afternoon tasks to complete in preparation for the household's domestic demands. For Philemon, this afternoon involves what might be called infrastructure maintenance, the kind of work that never ends in a large household. Furniture needs to be repaired, small items of wood or leather assessed and mended. Oil lamps need to be checked and filled with fresh olive oil, their wicks trimmed. The small clay lamps that provided light throughout the Roman house were functional and ubiquitous, each one holding perhaps a few hours' worth of oil, needing constant tending to ensure they burned cleanly without smoking excessively. In a house of moderate wealth, there might be dozens of these lamps in use on any given evening. Managing them was itself a significant task. He also spends time in the afternoon helping to prepare the household for the evening. The triclinium, the dining room, will be used tonight for the family's dinner, not an elaborate party, just the household dining together, which was still an occasion that required preparation. The dining couches, the triclinia that gave the room its name, each large enough for 2 or 3 people to recline while eating, needed to be arranged correctly. The table needed to be set. The kitchen was already in full activity, the sound and smell of serious cooking filling that part of the house. Roman cooking was sophisticated and labor-intensive in ways that surprise modern readers who encounter it. The Romans used complex spice combinations, influenced by trade connections that stretched to India and Arabia. They made elaborate sauces. They combined flavors in ways that modern palates might find strange, sweet and savory mixed freely, the garum providing an underlying salty umami note to almost everything. Fish was popular. Pork was popular. Legumes, particularly lentils and chickpeas, were staples. Vegetables were abundant. The kitchen slaves spent hours in the afternoon preparing whatever meal the master or mistress had ordered, working in the smoke and heat of the kitchen hearth, chopping and mixing and tasting and adjusting. Their labor largely invisible to the people who would eat the results. Philemon occasionally assists in the kitchen when extra hands are needed. He is not the primary cook. That role belongs to a slave named Felix who has considerable pride in his culinary skills, the kind of specialized expertise that gave a slave a degree of identity and even status within the slave world. But carrying heavy pots, fetching ingredients from the storage areas, washing the enormous quantity of dishes and vessels that a Roman kitchen generated, these tasks were shared among whoever was available. The afternoon moves toward evening. This is the time when, if life were kind, there might be a visit to the baths. The public baths of Rome, the thermae, were one of the genuine democratic institutions of Roman life, open to free citizens and, in most cases, to slaves as well, either with a small admission fee or sometimes free entirely. The great baths of Rome were extraordinary buildings, not just places to wash but social centers, exercise facilities, libraries, gardens, places of gossip and business and relaxation. The bathing process itself was elaborate and felt wonderful after a long day of physical labor. You move through a series of rooms of increasing temperature, from the frigidarium, the cold room, through the tepidarium, the warm room, to the caldarium, the hot room with its steam and heated water. You might have your body scraped with a metal tool called a strigil, removing the combination of sweat and oil that substituted for soap in Roman bathing culture. You might swim in the large pool. You might sit in the steam and feel the tension of the day dissolve from your muscles. Philemon does not get to go to the baths today. There simply is not time, with the household preparations needed for evening. Perhaps tomorrow. The baths are a frequent enough pleasure that their absence today is not particular cause for distress. He carries this knowledge with the experienced acceptance of someone who has learned not to expect too much from any given day. The evening meal is prepared and served. This is a busy period, perhaps the busiest of the day for household slaves. Marcus returns from his business in the city, bringing with him slightly elevated energy from his afternoon of social and business interaction. The family gathers. In Roman fashion, they recline on the dining couches rather than sitting, a posture that strikes modern readers as odd, but that the Romans considered both comfortable and civilized. The slaves serve. Serving dinner in a Roman household was a performance of a particular kind. The movement of dishes, the timing of courses, the management of the wine, all of it had to flow smoothly. The Romans typically drank their wine mixed with water, often with spices or honey added, because wine was fermented to such a high alcohol content that drinking it undiluted was considered barbaric and potentially dangerous. The slaves managing the wine service needed to get the mixture right, not too strong, not too weak, appropriate for the level of festivity the occasion called for. The family talks during dinner. They discuss the day's business, family matters, gossip about mutual acquaintances, whatever news has circulated through the city. A Roman dinner conversation, even an informal household one, might range across philosophy, literature, politics, business, personal matters, all in the fluid way of people comfortable in each other's company. The slaves who move around the table hear all of this too, adding it to the vast archive of overheard conversation that makes up so much of their knowledge of the world beyond their immediate experience. There is an interesting historical debate about how much Roman slaves understood about the broader political world they lived in. The Roman Empire was an entity of extraordinary scale and complexity. Events in distant provinces affected commerce, and therefore affected the prosperity of households in Rome. Political changes at the top had ripple effects throughout society. Did slaves follow these larger currents? Almost certainly some of them did, particularly the literate, educated slaves who worked in secretarial and administrative roles. Whether Philemon followed the debates in the Senate or the outcomes of military campaigns in distant provinces is harder to say. His world was, of necessity, a largely local world. The house, the market, the street between them, the neighborhood. But human curiosity is not extinguished by circumstance, and it is quite likely that even Philemon had some sense of the larger world, absorbed through overheard conversations and the fragments of information that passed through the city's public spaces. Dinner ends. The family retires from the dining room, moving toward the evening's remaining activities, perhaps further conversation in the atrium, perhaps reading, perhaps preparing for sleep. The slaves clear the dining room. Dishes are collected, food remnants gathered. The good news, the remnants of the family's dinner, distributed according to the informal hierarchy of the slave quarters, will be tonight's slave's meal, and it is considerably more varied and interesting than this morning's bread. This is the communal meal of the slave world in this household, eaten together in the kitchen or in the small shared space of the slave quarters, with more relaxation and less performance than any meal eaten in the family's rooms. People talk with their mouths full. Someone makes a joke. There is a kind of warmth in this that has nothing to do with servitude and everything to do with being human in a shared space with other humans who know you. The evening deepens. The last lamps are trimmed. The household moves toward sleep. But the work is not quite finished. Final rounds must be made through the house, checking that fires are properly banked, that the door is secured, that nothing is left out of order. The Ostarius settles into his position near the door, ready for the night. Other slaves complete final duties and make their way to their sleeping spaces. Philemon checks on Irene before he settles for the night. She is already asleep, her small face relaxed in the way that children sleep, deeply, entirely. He watches her for a moment in the lamplight. There is something he wants for her that he cannot name precisely in the vocabulary available to him, because the thing he wants, freedom, real freedom, is so far outside the practical reality of his world that it exists more as a feeling than as a formed thought. But he wants something for her, some widening of possibility, some protection from the worst that the world could do. He cannot give her these things. He can only be present. He can only do his work well enough that the household sees value in him, and in doing so perhaps also in her. He can only love her in the hours and moments that circumstance allows. He goes to his sleeping space. The night sounds of Rome drift through the walls, the wagons beginning their nocturnal routes again, distant voices, the bark of a dog, the ever-present sound of a city that is, at its heart, impossible to silence. He lies down. He does not think about tomorrow, or about the day after, or about the year ahead. This is perhaps the most striking thing about what we can imagine of his inner life, the foreshortening of time horizon that extreme powerlessness creates. When you cannot control your future, the future becomes less real, less worth investing mental and emotional energy in planning. You live in the day, in the hour, in the immediate. This is not wisdom exactly. It is adaptation to a particular kind of constraint, but it has some of the shape of a kind of peace, even if it is a peace made from necessity rather than from choice. The night is long. The hours pass. The city murmurs and rumbles in its ancient stone canyons. Somewhere across the city, 1,000 fires burn in 1,000 different rooms, and in each of them, lives are being lived with the same mixture of labor and small comfort, worry and small pleasure, love and loss, and the dogged persistence of simple living. Most of those lives will leave no record, no name in any archive, no stone with an inscription. Most of them will pass through the world as completely and invisibly as breath. But they were here. Philemon was here. His daughter was here. The woman in the kitchen, the old man with the aching knee, the clever secretary, the door slave. All of them were here, fully present and fully human in a world that officially classified them as property. Their daily reality was Rome as much as any emperor's marble palace. Their labor was the foundation without which the civilization above them would have been impossible. And their humanity, expressed in the small daily acts of love and care and persistence and quiet endurance, was as real and as complete as any humanity the ancient world contained. Sleep now, as Philemon sleeps. Let Rome fade around you into something soft and distant, the sound of the city like a tide, going out and out and out. The ancient world settles into its long night. The slaves sleep. The masters sleep. The city breathes. And somewhere in the darkness, between one moment and the next, the past becomes the past again. And you are here, in the present, safe and warm, with nothing required of you until morning. Rest. You have earned it. Simply by being alive and breathing in this world, you have earned it. The story is done. The day is complete. Let sleep take you now, gently, as it took Philemon all those centuries ago, in a room not so different from any room you have ever closed your eyes in, with the world outside still making its noise, and the dark inside, kind and quiet, asking nothing, offering everything. Sleep well.